I hear there are people in Ann Arbor who use drugs. Could be mistaken, but I think that's probably the case. And I think some of them have overdoses and have harms associated with that drug use. You know, most drug use does not really produce a lot of harms, but there are some very powerful harms that can emerge out of that. And Ann Arbor is not exactly in some radically different position than other cities. You don't have safe injection facilities. I'm not sure what the needle exchange situation is. What kind of steps are they taking to reduce the overdose deaths that don't rely on putting more people in prison? Or interdiction, you know, stopping the flow of drugs, which is impossible and ridiculous. It's designed to fail. There are, I'm sure, problems in the student community around sexual assault and violence that the police are not very effective in addressing. And that the more the police get involved, the less people are inclined to cooperate because they don't want these things to be handled in the criminal justice system because the outcomes for them are not very good often. So what is being done to address, you know, sexual violence, domestic disputes, etc., that don't rely on the police? So I think we have to take the practical high ground and say that we actually are talking about how to make our community safer, and you continue to just defend this thin blue line nonsense, which is entirely ideological and ineffective. So that's what I would think about, try to do, etc.
And also related to anti-immigrant deportation stuff, which people have done too, right? I mean,
Okay.
thinking about sanctuary city in a broader way.
Great.
Perhaps this would be just a good place to pause, and first let's applaud our panelists. It's about 3:30-ish, so we have about half an hour for questions from the audience. And does anyone have any questions for any one of our panelists? Yes, sir.
Michigan is about to vote on recreational marijuana. I'd like to get your thoughts.
I'm for it. In all seriousness, of course I'm for it. Now, not all legalization schemes are the same, so we have to be careful. Legalization schemes that create very tight regulatory regimes can still produce criminalization of people who possess or use or sell outside of the legalization regime. So this is a problem in Colorado and even more so in Washington. So that young people of color are still getting arrested on marijuana charges because they're not selling through the licensed dispensaries. Now, Washington, D.C. has a model that is decriminalization that says that you can own, grow, possess, or give away marijuana without penalty. So fewer arrests are occurring as a result. But you don't have the system of quality control and taxation that provides resources that might feed back into positive programs. We have a bill in New York that is a legalization bill, but includes the right to possess and grow and have and give away, and creates a mechanism for raising tax money and has directed spending programs so that we want that money to go back into communities that have suffered from the war on drugs, etc. So that to me is the ideal kind of model for now. And we should do that for all drugs.
I'm coming from Toledo, Ohio, and we have the same kind of problems with with the political leadership in the city. But on top of that, last year, Jeff Sessions came and he announced a new pilot program for dealing with youth gang crime, and Toledo's going to be a part of it, and they're going to give a lot of money, and the politicians, they want that money. And I mean, I know Black Lives Matter and ACLU have been trying to push back, but it's kind of frustrating. How does that, in general, become an obstacle? Like what can people do to get around that? Once the Justice Department gets really heavy involved in that.
Yeah. So, fortunately, the Justice Department resources are fairly limited, so they can't do that everywhere. They pick a few places to have these targeted interventions. But those interventions are incredibly counterproductive. And I think we have to point out what's behind them. When did Jeff Sessions ever care about the safety of Black people in Black communities? Right? That's not what's motivating him, and we can look at his record to make that clear. This is about an ideological project of defining the behavior of young people of color as organized criminality and gangs, and by labeling them that way, it's about saying that they are less than human, and the only possible way we can deal with them is more and more incarceration, violence, etc. So I think we need to call out the motivation of Sessions, but also we've got to call out the motivation of the local officials. Why is it so important for them to define the very real problems in these neighborhoods as only responding to these coercive and punitive interventions? And to me, the way to do that is we've got to organize communities to call for non-punitive solutions to their problems and say, actually, we've got a lot of people in this community who've been trying to keep the violence under control and work with our young people, but we get no help, no resources. The police undermine all the positive work that we do. Why can't we have resources? Why can't we get a chance to solve these problems? We know what the problem is better than anyone. We know who these young people are. They're our cousins, our nephews, our brothers. Give us a chance to solve these problems. We'll put that money to use, and here's what we would do. And we got lots of examples around the country of cure violence sites and restorative justice programs that could be models for how these resources could be spent. If you want to talk to me afterwards, I can give you some specific connections.
I'd love to. And I should also say, one of the things that Black Lives Matter and working with the ACLU have done is created a survey and talked to hundreds of people in the community about the idea of safety. How do they define safety? And it's much broader and involves a lot of the kind of the reforms that you mentioned. Having access to mental health counselors and whatnot. So
the ACLU has come a long way on this because they were big proponents of all these procedural reforms for a long time. Well, they would enter into a lawsuit and come up with an agreement that was like some training improvements and some better record keeping and things like that, and that just never made any difference. But they, at the national level, have embraced a depolicing strategy, and I'm meeting with them next week in their national offices to talk more about how to do this. And other groups are moving in this direction. So it's a good time to call on the ACLU nationally to step in with some more resources around organizing or whatever to try to turn the tide on this. And they are awash in money because of the resistance to Trump folks. So, keep them moving in the right direction and put some resources into it.
Oh, I'm
Can I
sorry.
just mention
Yeah, sure.
something at a local level? So I actually don't know if this has already come up for a vote because it's not on my radar enough, but the mental health millage that was passed in Washington County, The sheriff's department proposed 2 or 3 weeks ago to take the bulk of that millage and to pay for a bond over a 4-year period, it's upwards of $6 million, to take it and pay for it in a totally sort of like transformation of the dispatch center, so the 911 center. I think the argument being made there is that they'll respond faster to people with mental health problems. So that's an example of what you've mentioned in Toledo, but the pace at which the money that was allocated for people in distress has been so quickly incorporated into like the practice as usual. And I don't know if the second vote has happened in front of the county commissioners, but it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago that it first came up. And maybe if you're on the DSA mailing list, we can find out what's happening with that. But it's a huge, huge amount of money and a very quick grab to move it towards not even reform, to actually just pay for the 911 services to be upgraded, like for computers and a new housing facility, all kinds of stuff. So.
Amy, you had a question?
Yeah, so I wanted to respond to something that you said at the very beginning of your talk about like not being particularly excited about the conviction of,
Van Dyke.
So, given the context of the ways with like police violence, where time after time police aren't held accountable by either the criminal injustice system or any transformative standards whenever they kill a black kid, as like a non-black abolitionist, I don't necessarily feel that now is the time for non-black folks, particularly white folks, to express that they're like not excited about that conviction, especially since like, I don't know, I find myself stuck as well, kind of between denouncing all instances where the criminal injustice system is used and understanding that like, looking at instances like where an officer kills somebody, due to current realities, history, or power dynamics, this person can't ever be expected to be held to any standards of community accountability. And seeing that for families, while I don't believe that healing should necessarily be tied to whatever happens to a perpetrator, this is the closest thing to justice that they can realistically expect to see. So I was wondering if you could maybe say more about like the process of abolition as like a process, wherein like it hinges on the like learning of transformative practices, rather than sitting somewhere and saying that like, well, you know, like all instances wherein the criminal injustice system is used to punish someone is blanket a negative thing.
So, first, I don't see it as my mission to go around and wag my finger at people who are happy about this conviction. I understand that this is what people have asked for. I understand that they feel some justice in this. But I do have an analysis, and I do share it in spaces like this. And in fact, I take the lead. I'm taking the lead of, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, of Mariam Kaba, actually, who very nicely articulated this whole, the limitations of a put killer cops in jail politics. And she said, look, when has this system existed to provide justice for us? And by us, she means black people in the United States. And so anyone who thinks that these systems are going to provide us with justice are mistaken. First of all, almost never are these cops convicted, and even when they are, we don't actually end up getting anything out of it. So lots of experienced, articulate African-American activists have been making this analysis before I got into it. And we do need to put forward an analysis in the context of we're all trying to figure this out together, and there has to be a real exchange of ideas, of saying that, you know, equating justice with punishment is exactly the logic that got us into the mess that we're into. And so what we need, I think, to do a better job of is to say what justice could look like if not punishment. So we want officers to be held accountable. And we want there to be consequences for their actions. But we need to be more creative in thinking about what those could be, such that they produce better outcomes for the communities that have been most affected. We can look, for instance, at the role of truth and reconciliation commissions around the world, none of which are perfect, all of which have had limitations because of the political context in which they're trying to operate. But in a lot of cases, when you talk to family members, listen to what they're saying. A lot of what they want is some truth about what happened, some acknowledgement that it was wrong, and some effort to prevent it from happening in the future. But these criminal convictions often don't provide any of those things. The officer continues to deny that they did anything wrong. Van Dyke was like just blatantly saying he did something that the videotape does not show. To this day, he's like, I just didn't do what the videotape says. I don't care what the videotape says. I felt like he was attacking me and running at me.
Yeah.
There's no acknowledgement of what really happened. The police union is not acknowledging it. Rank and file officers are not acknowledging. They continue to say he didn't do it. There's no real truth telling about what produces an officer that will do that. And there's no commitment on the part of the Chicago police, the mayor, to make any real changes in policing that are going to prevent these horrible outcomes. So I'm not interested in attacking people or calling people out. I'm just interested in saying we've got to work harder, we've got to look deeper, we've got to understand the limitations of this.
Just add to that as well, in relation to, I think BYP 100 has also never calls, for instance, to jail and kill cops.
Right.
But they gave the autonomy to the family, and so I think it's a complicated question, right? I think talking about truth and reconciliation commissions, but also just thinking about dictatorships in Latin America, for instance. Argentina is a paradigmatic case in which the military junta from 1976 to 1983, which disappeared tens of thousands of people. It was paradigmatic to try these fascists that literally summarily executed and disappeared tens of thousands of people. And again, the prison appears as a casual solution to social problems, right? And so putting these fascists in prison was for many people, including mothers and so on, that lost their children, as part of leftist guerrillas or not, in Argentina, saw this as part of, as justice, right? And yet, of course, the laws that were created during the dictatorships continue to exist and continue to regulate how, the country's run. I mean, it's something similar in Chile, right? The Constitution, the Chilean Constitution is the Constitution that was made during the dictatorship in 1980. And so, I think that there is something not only about what it is that we want justice to be and imagining what justice could be, but I think also as doing away with the idea that prisons solves our problems, right? Which is precisely the problem that we're facing, right? As Alex just said. Prison and police as the catch-all solutions to social problems, as Ruth Wilson Gilman, for instance, the geographer and abolitionist talked about. So I'm just adding this other data point, right? Because it's not only just about the United States. I think a lot of this discussion has focused on the US, but I appreciate the Truth and Reconciliation Committees think about this internationally, right, as well, in other settings. Having said that, though, I think there is a question, for a lot of us that even claim the name abolition, of what does it mean for social struggle and social transformation to take place without something like violence. So I think there's also perhaps implicit and naive critique of violence, implicit in not using policing in prisons, right? And so the question I think we're faced with is what is the function of violence in general in reproducing it, but also transforming it, right? So I think that's a broad question.
Right.
Yeah.
I would just say, though, that in this context, what we're talking about is the state's systems of violence are somehow going to liberate us. And that, I don't think we want to make that mistake. If we're in a different kind of situation, if we're in a Northern Ireland or a South Africa under apartheid situation where we're thinking about how do we, make revolutionary change or whatever, then we have to have a different conversation where other considerations factored in, absolutely.
Okay, so just add to that,
That's a little vague, but.
yeah, I mean, the question is also then, is it about also punitive, right? So I mean, I think a lot of us
Right.
that affirm claim abolition is penal abolition, right? Abolition, punishment as such. So that's what I was referring to as well.
Yes.
Perhaps there has to be a distinction between abolition as a horizon of abolishing all forms of punishment, and abolition as a horizon of abolishing, police and prisons as they currently stand in this society, which I would call racial capitalism.
For me, it's a practical question
Totally.
that is, at this historical moment, what it means to me is, show me your problems and let's figure out non-coercive solutions that don't just reproduce the logic of racial capitalism. And we have a lot of ways of doing that. Now, there's going to be limits to producing true social justice within this political economic framework. And at some point, the kinds of changes I'm talking about are going to come up against certain limits, and then other kinds of strategic conversations are going to have to be had about what is it going to, but the situation we're in now is that lots of people who suffer under abusive policing continue to call for reforms that further their oppression. So that's the starting point for me.
So, if I have misinterpreted your comments, please interject, Amory. But I think that there's something to be said here for, it's something I've been really struggling with the last few months, the ways in which, and this is from my personal experience, white organizers approach some of these problems, and that includes the sort of discourse that we engage in. There's a lot of things that Miriam Cava says that I'll never say, because just is impossible and it'll be inappropriate. And she talks a lot about the need for people to have a balance between experiential and political kind of map for abolitionist organizing. And that there's a risk, she's talking often about victims of sexual violence, of falling into a sort of reactionary mode without a political analysis. But if I lack certain experiential qualifications for this work, and I lacked many, I don't come into rooms to people and say, I have a political analysis that you need. I mean, I think that there's something to be said in the way I understood your question, is that just that it's a particularly sort of, it can seem as a kind of detached analytical way of approaching a problem that is so deep and dire for people in specific visceral ways, because they lost a family member, or because, so there's a tension there where I feel like it's asking specific communities to have a revolutionary, the best political analysis and survive the experience, which is so harmful. And I think that that's frankly unfair. And so I try to put the burden in my own speech on how do I develop the solidarity politics I need to do the work, and how do I deepen my political practice so that it doesn't seek to erase people's experiences, even in ways in which I'm attempting to actually be an ally or to be supportive. So I mean, I kind of agree with Amory, and I hear and respect your response. I think that they both can be true. That one, you're holding true to the analysis you have, and then the other is that 3 days after one of the most vicious cop killings in the country, he's convicted after getting on the stand and essentially denying that he'd done this. A week after Kavanaugh is put on the Supreme Court, that it's important to be sensitive to the ways in which those experiences can be so strong, and that's. I just don't think that the burden is going to should fall on communities in Chicago to solve a problem that we are all, and the we here it has tension in it too, right? So I'm implicated in the systems of police in the United States, but I don't experience them. So like this question of kind of I and we statements perhaps, and ways in which, language is important. So I think I agree with a lot of what you said, and I also hear what Amory said, and I think some of the work I'm trying to do as a white organizer, thinking about abolition and working in this policing project in Ann Arbor, is actually to deal with some of those tensions. In part because some of the things I've said and done this summer, which are based on experiences of people of color that are quite close to me, things people have asked me to do, things I've read, people like Miriam Cava, they're read in a general audience as actually patronizing, I'm telling people what to do. And so I'm kind of in this tension all the time. And I think that I take the question to heart. I think it's an important question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Matt?
So one of the three we think about, so we, as Sarge mentioned, we had this mental health millage passed here in the county. Even when it was before it was passed, it was co-opted by the police to add funding to police, and now it's being co-opted even further. So I'm wondering, number one, if you've seen any good examples, number two, what are your thoughts on maybe some examples could be on like a dual power where we're organizing alternative structures outside of the state apparatus to deal with some of these problems that we deal with the police right now in terms of mental health, restorative justice, things like that.
I mean, that's what folks in Oakland have been trying to do, is they've been trying to identify community resources in terms of individual skill sets, community-based organizations, collective efforts that people could turn to deal with community problems so that they don't have to call 911. And I think that can be a very important part of building towards what we want, but this work is being done in communities that lack a lot of resources. So to expect them to be able to overcome all these community problems without outside assistance is not, I think, entirely realistic, especially when so many forces are directly working against them while they're trying to do this. I mean, it'd be one thing if they were just left alone or something, but no one's left alone in this world. So I think as long as it's understood that it's part of building political power and laying out a logic of a different way of approaching things, but always demanding that we get the resources and the support that we need and to get the cops off our backs as part of that analysis.
We have time for one more question.
Can we have a minute at the very end to talk about local organizing?
Yes.
To do some, okay, great, yeah.
Well, actually, maybe this would, unless there is a very pressing question out here, maybe we could turn to that, because we've got about 10 minutes left before we end.
You can ask a question. I'll do the organizing part fast.
Okay, I have one question. Most of the folks in this room, I know as organizers, and what, from each panelist perhaps, how can we begin conversations with and change the minds of those who believe police exist to protect us? Okay, if I'm having a conversation with my mom, what's a good way to begin these conversations? And maybe we can start with them, whoever feels compelled to speak first, but I'd like that short, quick answer.
I wanted to mention earlier, briefly, the work done by Wicker in the area, in part because I think Wicker's a really good example of doing some on-the-ground, the sort of like outside of police organizing that you're talking about. And the kind of support they provide people, it's just phenomenal, enormous, and not always visible, but in the absence of a solution to the encroachment of ICE and the sort of violent policing of immigrants in our community, Wicker's doing a lot of substantial work, even though that there's a lot of things they can't change. So I wanted to mention that briefly. And then, can you repeat part of your question and I'll finish my answer?
How can we begin conversations with and change the mind of those who believe police exist to protect us?
So I think that the example of ICE I had hoped would be a good way to lead people into these conversations, but it has failed so many times. And all of the Ann Arbor politicians we're dealing with have been very vocal about anti-Trump, anti-ICE stuff, but cannot somehow make the connection. So yeah, I'm looking forward to other responses to that.
No pressure, no pressure. Well, I think that's one of the reasons I often talk about the war on drugs in these events, is because I do think there is a lot of space right now to talk to people about how policing is not working. That all we have to do is look, and that people who are suffering as a result of that are not just poor black people in the south side of Chicago, that they're middle-class white kids who are not being served by the war on drugs, who are having ODs. And so to just say, maybe there are other ways to solve this problem other than just, arresting everybody under the sun for being a drug user. But you gotta have those concrete alternatives at your fingertips. It's gotta be concrete, it's gotta be practical. I think, also, do we want to solve the homelessness problem by, creating these laws against sitting in public and lying down and putting more homeless people into the jail, which is very expensive and doesn't improve their situation and doesn't lead to housing. And so that's another, and that's how I tried to write the chapters of the book. It's just like, here's why policing doesn't work. This is why the reforms are not going to fix it. This is what we need to do that just takes police out of the equation entirely.
I mean, just to go along with what people have said, I mean, I think that this question of, I want to return to the question of experience, which is really important, because changing people's minds assumes that is how we do politics, that we do minds through the kind of rational discursive way. I think so much of politics is also, bodies coming together and how they're affected by one another and so on, right? And so, but I think the question of experience is interesting, and I often take the hint from this poet called Fred Moten. Have people heard about Fred Moten? And he talks about coalition as understanding that this thing is killing you too, you stupid motherfucker, however much more slowly, right? This is what he says. And so I think part of maybe Alex's book allows us to think about the ways in which, even though there's different experiences, different ways in which people's, different populations bear the brunt of state violence in different ways, this also creates a possibility to, find camaraderie and solidarity and other forms of coming together. And so I think part of the work to convince people, maybe not people's minds, would be to find those common experiences like, the fear of deportation. And I mean, this is how I was radicalized. I was undocumented for a long time. And, anti-black violence, but also settler colonialism, and also just living in this fucking society which exploits us all, right? And so thinking about how these come together and finding concrete answers, as people have said, I think is a way to do that, right? Finding the common interests as much as we can, but also recognizing the differences, right?
Just want to say, so I grew up in a pretty small town, conservative area in Pinckney, and Pinckney had a very large opiate problem for a long time, and it's starting to get better now. And surprisingly, in Pinckney, which is a very conservative town, the police millage that was on the ballot only passed by a slim margin, which is very surprising. And I think it shows that people, even in conservative areas, are seeing that the war on drugs has not been, healthy for their neighborhoods.
I feel about local organizing. I also want to say that one of the ways we practice this in some of our inner organizing is something called Snacksis, which is the practice of having good snacks. It's key. So I know a few of you through various organizing efforts in the last year, Stop Spencer Coalition, and then most recently there's been a group of organizers working on this Police Oversight Board initiative, which, to be fair, is maybe a good test case for how reform projects can sort of draw you in and then you struggle to make them more not reform, and then they just eat you up. Anyway, it was not the intention of really any of the organizers involved to get involved in a reforms project, nor did it seem like that maybe at the beginning.